In preparing for today's session, I was reminded of a keynote speech that I saw not too long ago, and it was ironically on the subject of trust. And I say ironically because I actually found the presentation off-putting because the speaker was more focused on performing rather than making a meaningful connection with the audience. In looking around the room, however, it was clear that some found him very engaging and entertaining. Until the Q&A portion, that is, because the way in which the speaker responded to the questions was very dismissive and sometimes defensive. It was obvious that he considered the performance to be over and he was ready to move on. And that's when many of the promoters shifted to detractors. What I observed that day was recently validated in a study done by the University of Texas at Austin. And what the research found is that how speakers handled questions and objections actually had a greater impact on the audience's evaluation of the speaker's effectiveness than the presentation itself. So in other words, how a speaker responds to questions and objections matters more than the actual presentation. We mention frequently on this program that communication is about connection, and responding to questions and objections is an opportunity to maintain and strengthen that connection. Hello, and welcome to PowerSpeaking Live. I'm Carrie Beckstrom, your host of this monthly series and the CEO of PowerSpeaking Incorporated. Today, we're going to be discussing a whole host of strategies that will help you to effectively respond to questions and objections. And honing this skill is essential to holding your own in the moment and taking what can sometimes be a challenging situation and turn it into an opportunity for more meaningful connection and impact. Now, as we explore this topic today, I encourage you to pose your questions and comments in chat. We'll do our best to model best practices as we respond to your questions. And joining us today are three expert panelists I'm eager to introduce to you. First, we have Sharon Black. Sharon is President of Account Management for Robert Half, where she oversees the North American sales team. And among many other accolades, Sharon was named one of the most influential women in business by the San Francisco Business Times. And Sharon, I know you have a wealth of experience in fielding those hard-hitting questions from the C-suite and many others. Welcome.
Thank you, Carrie.
Also with us is Dan Malloy. After a decade working in the newsroom as a sports anchor and reporter, Dan joined the Concussion Legacy Foundation, an organization devoted to bringing an end to CTE. As communications manager for the Concussion Legacy Foundation, Dan often has to navigate very sensitive, sometimes controversial topics with journalists and many other stakeholders. Welcome, Dan. It's a delight to have you here.
Thank you, Carrie. It is really great to be here with everyone.
And last but not least, we have Amy Ferber. Amy Ferber is a facilitator and coach for PowerSpeaking, and I've had the pleasure of observing Amy expertly field questions and objections and teach and coach others to do the same. In fact, just last week, Amy and I were in Washington, D.C. at a Women in Tech conference where Amy facilitated a workshop. After her session, our booth was flooded with women who attended the program talking about how transformative the learning experience was. And welcome, Amy.
Thank you.
Delight to have you. And if you'd like to learn more about PowerSpeaking's services, we have included a few brochures in chat that you can check out. Now let's get into it. I'd like to kick off with a few stories. Sharon, would you share with us one of the most challenging questions you've received in a presentation or a meeting?
Absolutely. Thank you, Carrie. And again, good morning, everybody. I'm delighted to be here. You know, I think I'll start out by sharing with everybody, and Carrie, I think you can relate. You never forget that first moment where you have a situation that occurs that you can reflect on and think about, okay, how did I really handle that? And was that the best way to handle it? So let me paint the picture for you. I was at a presentation that I was leading. In the audience was my sales team, along with my boss and her boss. And we were presenting the third quarter results and what the projections were for fourth quarter. And I had just recently taken over a new team, so I was excited. I had lots of energy. When I got up to present the numbers, I gave an overly optimistic, positive view of where we stood. And so I was ready to continue on into what my projections were going to be for fourth quarter when the boss said, "Hold on, I disagree with what you just said." And my first instinct was surprise. And then my next instinct, I'm sure, was, do I look like a deer in the headlight? And at that moment, I thought, Sharon, you got to pivot, take a breath. And so what I did was I took a moment to breathe, and then I said, you know what? You're right. These numbers are not as glorious as they look. Let's level set with the team and with you, because it's really important that we all understand that this is okay performance. And I think my energy of taking over this new team got ahead of me. And so let's really talk about the three things we need to do to propel and project the growth into fourth quarter. And so I hoped in that moment that I overcame something that was a surprise I wasn't ready for. I think I was just rolling, and I thought the Q&A was going to come after the presentation, when in fact, he did me a favor, but I didn't see it that way at first, right? He did me a favor to make sure that I level set where we were going and that where we needed to go. And that was really important. But after the meeting, you know, I replayed it again, Carrie, like we all do. And I thought, well, why did that happen? What did that happen? And then that struck the reality of, you know, that was actually a good thing.
Absolutely. In the moment, I'm sure it didn't feel so great, as you acknowledged. And there's so many really important points you made there. One is, even if you structure a session and indicate that here's my objectives, here's the agenda, I'd like to hold questions and answers till the end, especially if you're delivering to senior leaders, you can't control like that. You have to be prepared for those objections and questions to come at any moment. And I also really appreciated, the pause to think about it, catch your breath, and also just how authentic you were in acknowledging what prompted you to be overly optimistic due to your excitement of taking over this new team. Wow, that's a great example, and it takes, I think, a lot of experience and courage to be able to pivot as quickly as you did. How about you, Dan? Do you have a story for us?
I wish that I had one that included such a tactful pivot in the moment, but I'll share a story from when I was a student journalist. My background is in sports journalism in local news media. When I was a senior in college, I worked at the local NBC station in Central Missouri, where I went to college. And the head of the broadcast department would critique the newscast with all of the producers and reporters after the 10 o'clock news. And this is a mentor of mine, Dr. Kent Collins, may he rest in peace. I look up to him very much. And I had a pretty uninspiring story that night about kind of the future of this historic downtown Columbia, Missouri building. Didn't get a great story out of it that I really wanted to. And he kind of covered that exact point. And then at the end of it, he asked me a question that totally put me on my heels. He said, Dan, who cares? And I was like, whoa. Unfortunately, I did not have a great pivot and a great answer in the moment, but that has totally stuck with me all through my media career, all through my, year plus in as a professional, marketing and social media communicator. Who cares? Someone who is totally issue neutral or story neutral. You're just telling them about this issue or this story for the first time. Why should they care? It will always stick with me. And I have, a really red-faced, embarrassing moment to look back on, but it has completely informed kind of the way that I approach the way that I write or, produce a video, whatever this content I'm talking about is. Someone who has no idea whether it's the Concussion Legacy Foundation, whether it was a news story a few years back that I was working on, why should they care? And the things that, I kind of think about in those moments are emotion, good, compelling, stories that are tight, that will stick with you. And who cares? Ironically enough, is one of the questions that has really stuck with me that was in the moment extremely challenging, actually.
Painful, but an invaluable lesson, as you noted. Absolutely. And I so appreciate, Dan, you're getting at one of the most essential tenets of being an effective communicator, regardless of your role, regardless of your objectives. And that is to be so audience-centric. And part of what you have to have front and center is, why should they care? In training, we call that with them. What's in it for me? Thank you. Thank you for sharing. So were you just speechless?
I think my first instinct was to talk about the things that went wrong and where it came up short and, why the story maybe wasn't as strong as it could have been when it was assigned to me. But it was kind of a no-nonsense kind of format where I wasn't going to get much slack. So I just said, you know what, Dr. Collins, you're right. Someone who doesn't know about this building or these, the future development trying to take place here downtown, this story is not going to inform them. It's not going to stick with them. He was right.
Wow. And also, this is also, both of your stories are examples where two senior leaders really did you a favor that you learned from. All right. Thank you so much for setting the stage. So as you think about those challenging situations and others that are probably playing through your mind, let's transition to some how-to advice. Based on the study I shared at the outset, it's obviously very important that leading up to a presentation, you not only practice the presentation, but you also anticipate for what may come up in the moment. So, Amy, would you share your top tips for effectively preparing for questions and objections?
Sure. So I really have one top tip, and that is brainstorm the questions that you anticipate could come your way. And I do this in a couple of ways when I'm coaching someone. I'll say, I want you to set a timer for 2 minutes. And I want you to think of any possible question that could come up based on your content. And the 2 minutes, at least in my mind, is helpful because when you're anxious about Q&A, you can spend potentially days thinking about it and never getting it out of your head. And so this 2 minute opportunity for you either to type or write out those questions gets it out of your head, and you can really sit back and start to consider what are the answers to those questions. After the 2 minutes, if you look down at the list and you don't have very many, then your next task is to ask a colleague or your manager or even your partner at home or a friend. I recently was coaching someone who said, if the talk is a big enough deal to me, I'll present in front of my partner at home who has a completely different background, because they always inevitably ask one of the questions that comes up in the meeting, even though they don't know that much about my content. And then the final thing, which is newer to me, is you could potentially use AI as a tool to be able to brainstorm some of those questions. So it doesn't have to take a real long time to do that level of preparation, but it has a really big payoff. And then the final thing I would say is practice the answers, of course.
Yes. Do you have, I think perhaps PowerSpeaking has a recommended format. Do you have a recommended framework for responding to questions?
I sure do. Yeah. So PowerSpeaking, in a couple of our workshops, we will share a structure that helps people to organize their thoughts. And after paraphrasing a challenging question, then stating your position. What's the answer? How do you feel about this question? Give a reason to back up your response, and then share a concrete example or one clear nugget of evidence, and then bookend it again with your position. And that way it keeps you concise and you get really clear content across to the person asking you that question.
Excellent. You clearly have some experience coaching others on this. And I really appreciated that you suggest that they brainstorm possible questions for just 2 minutes, because I have found myself in preparing for some presentations that are, really high stakes and a broad, diverse audience, that sometimes I get overwhelmed and start to feel like, oh my gosh, how am I going to possibly acquire all the knowledge to be able to respond to any possible question that may come up? I mean, you try to be as thorough as you can, but there has to be some limitations. And I too am starting to use Chat GPT for that kind of purpose. And one of the things that's so valuable about that, as many of you I'm sure know based on your prompts, is you can describe the different types of positions that are going to be in the audience to get really rich perspective on the many different questions and objections that come up. And then that allows you to focus more time on preparing your responses than thinking about the questions. So great advice. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how you go about keeping your audience engaged and effectively responding to questions when dealing with executives. Can you take that for us, Sharon?
Yeah, I'd be glad to. I think first, Carrie, I would start with the pre-work, and that has to do with typically when you speak in front of the executives, most times you have a sponsor. And so based on the topic, you really want to talk to the sponsor about who is it in the audience that needs to be engaged, because oftentimes you're coming in and then there's another speaker behind you and maybe another speaker behind you because they're making decisions around multiple items. And so I think from an engagement standpoint, you want to make sure that you're focused in on the executives that you know are going to help make the decision or may ask a lot of Q&A. I think secondly is don't expect everybody in the room to be engaged because of that. They're busy. They have a lot of stuff going on, and all executives are different. You're going to see different types of things. I've been in one where I've had one paying attention to the whole thing and everybody else was on their cell phone, and you just can't let that throw you. And so I think that that's a really important item. Also, I would say is you are there for a reason. That you are there because you know something or you are in the detail of why the decision is being made. And so based on that, stay on topic, right? Because they clearly are looking for something that they need more information on to make that final decision or to move it and postpone it because they need to get further facts to make the best decision for the company. And I think sometimes where people go a little sideways on the engagement is they want to impart all of their knowledge in a presentation. And the executives expect you to know that. That's your job. So the best advice I can give you in any type of presentation from an engagement standpoint is start with your bottom line is your first line. And that's where you get your hook. They understand, you understand why you're there. And then when the questions go, I love what Amy said in preparation for Q&A. And I love what you said, Carrie, which I think is a great takeaway. If you over-prepare, your own head is starting to get overwhelmed, confused, etc. And so I love the 2 minutes and I love the Chat GPT because Chat GPT will also put things in categories for you. So if you prepare for, you think the top 3 questions, when a question comes at you that you didn't quite expect, normally the answer is in one of the 3 answers you got from Chat GPT. And if not, and you actually don't know the answer, then you should just be honest. That's a really good question. I need to go do some homework and come back to you. And I think oftentimes when I'd come into these presentations, I want the decision because it's for me to move on. But that may not always be the best direction. Or I get the decision and I think, yes, we can move on. And I'm excited about it. So I think I originally went into these types of presentations always wanting the sale, like, if you will, because I'm a salesperson. And that wasn't always what it was about. And you really need to understand that from your sponsor. And then you need to either leave with a decision to move forward, or you have to get back with more information to get that decision made.
Yeah, excellent. Oh my gosh. Those of you in our audience, I hope you were taking notes because there was a lot of rich nuggets in there. Something you made me think of, Sharon, back to the point about not over preparing. And if you start feeling kind of anxious, to go back to your point, I have been invited to this meeting for a reason. I'm a subject matter expert. I have some really essential knowledge, a point of view to impart. And to your point, if something comes up I don't know the answer to, it is perfectly acceptable to acknowledge that. And of course, make sure that you follow up. As a senior leader myself, it's really easy to detect when someone's trying to wing it or make it up. And instantly that person loses credibility. And I find myself being more critiquing as they go to ensure that what they're telling me is the real deal. So that's, I think, so important to remember. Thank you for all of that.
Absolutely. Dan, you'll go into the weeds too, Carrie. When they start, if you're like reaching in the clouds trying to come up with an answer, it's detectable, like you said. But then they'll really want to take you down the rabbit hole, maybe for fun or not. But it's just better to acknowledge, I'll get back to you. So I think this is really important because I've been down the rabbit hole before. I think my colleagues were laughing at the same time thinking, oh boy, I've been down one of those rabbit holes and I don't want to go down that rabbit hole with them.
Absolutely. I just want to acknowledge we've got some great comments in chat. Mary McGlynn says, I appreciate that both Sharon and Dan took accountability and immediately said, you're right. Absolutely. David Binder, right. So many of us immediately show defensiveness or spend way too much time justifying themselves. Absolutely, David. That, again, reminds me of the keynote speaker I mentioned at the outset, who, again, ironically was speaking on the subject of trust and became somewhat defensive and dismissive in his responses. So there was some incongruency there. Tara agreed. And as Carrie said, these leaders did them a favor. And Dan and Sharon responded from that perspective. Very impressive. All right. And we have a question. Ready to be prepared to model how you effectively respond? David Binder says, I'm interested in the panel's advice regarding what not to do when managing Q&A. Any career-limiting moves? Certainly, Sharon, you mentioned one, and that is to just ramble and make things up. What else? Any of you?
I think I'll just jump in. I think it's what I said earlier. You go in wanting to impress them with all the knowledge that you have, and you over-present. And again, they know that you have the knowledge or you wouldn't be in your job, and you certainly wouldn't be invited to the meeting. So I would just watch for that pitfall, because it's easier for us to go into. You want to take over the silence by you speaking, and sometimes it's just better to be silent. They might be thinking, might be writing down a question. I find my executives text each other, to see, if they want to bring up another question. And so you just wait, and then you ask, would you like me to proceed? Or, and then they will guide you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Excellent. Yeah. A few other things I would add. One is to ensure that when you're responding to the question, you open that up to the entire audience. What I have seen some speakers do, especially if they're kind of intimidated by the person who's asking the question, in an effort to make sure they fulfill the questioner's needs, have a tendency to just speak exclusively to that individual. And you run the risk of not alienating, but causing, the rest of the audience to kind of go off in other directions in their minds. And similar to that, I think it's also really important in managing Q&As that you don't allow someone to dominate. That's where you have to have the courage to, I really appreciate the enthusiasm and interest, going back to what we're here to accomplish, and then get back on topic.
I would add
go
ahead. Go ahead,
Amy. Oh, I was just going to kind of add to what Carrie just said about not being dominated and, standing your ground where necessary. On the other hand, though, it's important in my experience, both as an interviewer in my past, journalism jobs, and now kind of working in a field within concussion and CTE, which can involve some, adversarial interviews, some adversarial back and forths with Q&As at times. I really try to avoid at all costs allowing anything to escalate into a combative, argumentative back and forth, and leaving that with what people remember about the entire session. I would hate for this very important. So the most common presentation I give is a concussion reporting workshop, where I speak to professional and student journalists sharing best practices for reporting on sports with brain injuries and concussions on the field or on the ice. And I would hate for that very important curriculum to be overshadowed by an argument between myself and a journalist in the room about UFC or boxing, and leave that as kind of the thing that people take home with them, rather than the actual best practices and the lessons that I came there to share. I think that makes me look less effective, because I wasn't able to control kind of the Q&A itself, but also I've let, the important takeaways be overshadowed in a way that kind of undermines my own authority on the subject matter.
That's such an excellent point, Dan. Do you happen to have an example or any advice on tactics you use to help avoid it from escalating?
Well, I think what you mentioned moments ago, thanking them for their enthusiasm, showing deference and respect for their, appreciation for whatever their opinion is, their issue and their stance on, if it's a controversial issue, if it's a certain, just a difference of opinion about the subject matter itself. I think I just tried to de-escalate as soon as possible, and then offer to have a one-on-one conversation after the Q&A itself, or after the, whatever forum it is wraps up, because I don't want to take precious time away from, if I've got 45 minutes, an hour with this group. I don't want to spend 8-9 minutes on the same question going back and forth, when I can be, answering other questions or sharing additional lessons. So I think offering to follow up either in person immediately after, or on the phone or via email as a follow-up, I've found to be helpful, and, shows that I am not only willing to take on a challenging question, but also, willing to kind of meet them where they are and find some kind of middle ground, or at least a respect for each other's position on something.
Excellent. Amy, I think you...
Yeah, I was going to add. Yeah, I was just thinking about for many people, they want to show up as their best selves. They want to show up as smart as they know they are in the meeting, and will often want to just respond right away with the answer. The challenge here is if you don't 100% know what the question is, you might actually be answering something that isn't being asked. And so one of the strategies here that we practice with folks at PowerSpeaking is making sure that they paraphrase the question first. Did they understand it? Did they get the perspective that the questioner is actually asking before they respond? Because we've all been there where someone responded to a question, it wasn't the right answer to that question, and then the person had to correct them, and then they went back through it again, and we've now just wasted another 5 to 10 minutes. So this is a efficiency step, and it's also a step in the process of you looking a lot more confident in front of the room, just doing that quick check first.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That is such an excellent point, to take the time to make sure you're getting to the question behind the question. And again, if you got it wrong, great opportunity to get clarity and make sure that you're providing the information that they're really seeking. Well, David Binder, that question certainly prompted a rich discussion. Thank you. We have another one from Mary. Sharon mentioned working with a sponsor as a key to success. How do you approach that meeting with your sponsor? Sharon, would you be willing to take that?
Sure. I think that, first and foremost, I know why I'm being invited. I know the topic. I take a little bit of time to do pre-work. I do the, 2-minute question exercise that Amy suggested, which I think is excellent. And then I set up a meeting with him to say, I would like to talk with you about what I think are the best ways to, set up my presentation. Then these are the types of Q&A questions that I'm anticipating. And we just have a quick alignment that we're on the same page, because most of the people, if not all, know that he's my sponsor in the room, right? And typically the sponsor won't speak up unless they really feel like you're getting yourself in trouble, right? They want you to carry the day because obviously they're sponsoring you. And so typically that's very helpful in that, one, it shows you that you're on the right track, and that gives you confidence. If you're not on the right track, it allows you to reset, and then you put yourself on the right track of thinking, oh, good, I'm glad I didn't walk into that. I'm glad I asked the right questions. And then obviously they're typically in the executive suite. And so they have a pretty good idea of what needs to be communicated or answered to get the decision. And oftentimes they say, you might not get that decision today. We've got like 7 presentations today, and you're one of those 7. And that also helps to level set your confidence level, because to me, it's all about walking in, being calm and confident, and that you're ready. And you're going to get thrown, questions that are unexpected. You have to expect that. And that's okay. It's how you deal with it in the moment is what people are looking for.
Excellent. And knowing you have that advocate, knowing you have that sponsor, I think helps to also increase your confidence, or at least reduce your anxiety, because someone has your back and if needed can step in and assist. So we've been talking about all kinds of advice on how to deal with situations in the moment. So much of our interactions today are through social media. So Dan, could you share advice for anything to be aware of or best practices with relation to responding to questions through social media?
Sure. I think one thing we look at with social media interaction is intent. There are, unfortunately, a lot of engagement, a lot of comments you will see that are in bad faith, trolls, and I think the calculus that we have to make as the communications team, especially for a nonprofit where so much of our mission with the Concussion Legacy Foundation is just about education, is when we determine whether something's worth responding to publicly on our timeline, what can we accomplish here? Are they actually asking a question, or are they just trying to, make us angry or something like that? So I think if there's a lesson to be shared, even by making an example of a bad faith question, I think if we can expand and share something useful for someone who's going to see this, we're going to do it. If there's something that's maybe a little bit more pointed, someone that maybe has some kind of a, maybe a personal issue with someone on our team or with our mission, we'll start in the direct messages. We'll take that to DMs and just say, hey, can you maybe share a little bit more where you're coming from and, kind of why you're feeling this way? How can we kind of help you get where you're trying to go with this issue? But most often with engaging on, especially when it comes to controversial topics or, news items that involve, strong opinions on multiple sides of an issue, we want to stick to our mission, which for CLF is concussion safety without compromise and a world without CTE. So if we keep that in mind, we can kind of determine whether something is, one, worth engaging with, and two, are we able to share something valuable by addressing this directly? And usually the answer is yes. There's usually something we can share, even if it's just, a link to a resource on our website or a recent news article that kind of sheds more light on the topic. We are usually able to share something of value. That's not always going to be the case, of course. And, we're in a little bit of a unique space within sports, within public health, within nonprofit in general. But yeah, sticking with education, awareness, and the mission itself is usually kind of our guide rails, our guardrails for social media, because it can get pretty feisty sometimes, especially with, a very public case or a very, controversial issue.
Absolutely. Feisty is a good word for it, for sure. That's really, really sage advice. And so many themes that are coming up here. One is being really clear on the intent. And that's similar to what you were saying, Amy, to really make sure you're getting to the question behind the question and what really is at issue here, which is part of why this skill takes a lot of practice. There's a lot of finesse and nuance to it. Getting it right, though, man, so powerful. So we have another question that's come from Nate. Are there any tips in responding to tough questions we can use to help move the audience towards a call to action or get them to see our point of view? So any tips for responding to tough questions we can use to help them to move the audience to your call to action?
I'll just say something real quick about that. And that, at least for me, is part of the preparation piece. Know your audience. Know their perspectives. Know the kinds of things that they care about. If you're speaking to a mixed audience of people, obviously they're going to be coming from different perspectives. So you have someone in finance in the room. Well, you better have some backup content that's related to the data. You have someone in an engineer in the room, making sure that you have the details that you know that those folks would need. So I think in your answer is where you get to help persuade them by way of giving good examples that relate to those people and what they care about. That's where the convincing comes, without tons of effort on your behalf.
It's such an important point. Questions are often an opportunity to strengthen your case and facilitate reaching a decision, whether it's the decision you wanted or not. I mean, that is a good outcome if you can help the audience reach a decision. So yes, look at them as gifts. Look at them as gifts. So we have another question here, and then I want to get back to some that I have. Rachel is asking if there's any specific tips to managing Q&A in a virtual versus in-person setting.
One part of this that is actually taking place in this very session is that in a virtual setting, it can be easy to feel like I'm losing the crowd sometimes. So one thing that I do when I'm doing a virtual presentation or a virtual workshop is to take more frequent Q&A breaks rather than just waiting until the end to, we got 15 minutes, give me all your questions. They might be tired out and be less willing to ask questions on a Zoom format. So I think exactly what we're doing right here, engaging the audience throughout the presentation or workshop, whatever the event is a really good method I have found in my own experience to keep them engaged, keep them curious, and I think without the ability to most effectively use body language and eye contact and other kind of physical in the room techniques to engage your audience, I think directly addressing them and inviting, a little bit more interaction throughout is one way that I have found to be an effective way to, not only keep attention, but to keep curiosity going, throughout the hour or however long I've got.
Absolutely. Obviously, I agree. And just the other thing I'd add, and this is really a benefit to the audience and the speaker, is clearly nothing replaces in person, nothing. That said, a benefit to virtual is that the audience is able to pose their questions in multiple ways. I mean, not in this case, because obviously we have everyone on mute, but in a smaller session, people can speak up, or those that might not feel comfortable doing that and probably wouldn't ask the question if they were in person, they can do so through chat. And that's a benefit to the speaker as well, because you're getting even more input and opportunity to make sure that you're really addressing the audience's needs and keeping it really, really relevant. Okay, so I want to go back to you, Sharon, and just ask another question specific to an executive audience. When do you balance transparency with diplomacy?
That's a really good question. I think, first of all, you have to be very confident in your presentation style. I find that if you go in calm and you remain calm throughout, and that gives you the ability to field things, because you're also ready to hear the questions and you need to be listening. It's okay to have a little bit of nerve jump, that kind of gives you that, I think, when you're presenting. But I also think if you get overly nervous, some people then stop their listening skill, and then you may end up with what we've talked about today. You're not answering the question. You're kind of fielding what you think you heard. And so oftentimes I'll repeat the question just to make sure I'm, this is what you want me to present on, or however I want to paraphrase it. I think the other thing with transparency is to be real. You know what you know, and that's what you know. And so that's what you know to be true. And so provided that you're prepared, I oftentimes may have my bottom line as my first line in my presentation, but I also always include an appendix. And an appendix has more detail if I need to say, you know what, let's move to slide 35 or whatever number we're on. And let me bring this up and talk about a few key things here that allows for those data points to come out that perhaps we haven't discussed. Here's one thing that you can be sure of, at least in my company. My executives do their homework. They have read the entire deck. They have written all over it. They are ready. And oftentimes, you might start with, you think you're going to start with slide 1. And I have had so many times where the CEO or whomever within the company just says, Sharon, I want to go directly to slide 10. And that's the transparency that they're looking for, is like, I've read it all, so I get it. But now when we get to slide 10, let's immediately move to Q&A. And I might not even have a chance to actually present at first. We may move to Q&A, and that's okay. But I think it's going in, being confident, not overly prepared, know that you are being invited for a reason. And that in itself is really important. So I think those are the type of tactics that I would share, Carrie.
Excellent. All great points, Sharon. Rick, our founder, says, what not to say to a senior audience? Oh, good question. Amy, could you elaborate? Why do we advise not to use that response, especially when dealing with senior leaders?
Well, you've set yourself up a little bit, because if I say good question to Dan and respond, and good question to Sharon, and then when Carrie asks me a question and I just pause and then respond, potentially I could put her in a place that is not comfortable. She might get frustrated with me. She might assume things that aren't even true. So it's really a better idea to just pause, paraphrase, and then respond. If you are really struggling, you could say, let me take a moment to think about that.
Mm-hmm.
Then paraphrase and respond. So I think it just sets you up for some more success in the room, and no one feeling like someone has a better question than another.
Yeah. And Carrie, I'll give an alternate view as well. I'm not there to compliment the executive on a good question, right? So I think what Amy said is spot on, but it's also not my role to say to Rick or Mary, oh, great question. It's more about listening to the question, and then whether you're pausing or you're responding or you feel you need to paraphrase it just to make sure you've got it and get the acknowledgement. Oftentimes they might not speak. They'll say, yep. Then you carry on with your answer. So I just wanted to make sure that I threw that in because I think that's an important point.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's not our role to judge the quality of the question. And so often, I mean, that's just for so many people, just kind of this rote automatic go-to to buy yourself a little time. So it just takes practice, just like trying to eliminate us is substitute that typical response with a pause, just like you said, Amy. And additionally, it is perfectly fine to say, I need a minute to think on that. I respect that. It indicates that the speaker is taking this very seriously and wants to make this a quality connection. So let's talk about how to effectively do this when you're dealing with a very diverse audience. Maybe you're addressing people from all around the globe. Amy, any advice for ensuring that the way in which you respond is really inclusive and resonates with a diverse group?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. One, I think it's helpful to get away from the common colloquial language that we use with people. And we think we're being casual by saying, hey guys, how's it going today? So happy to be here with all of you. And really, if we just replace that with you or you all, hey you, not hey you, hey everyone, I'm happy to be here with all of you. Suddenly that is just more inclusive. And really, if it doesn't bother you, that's fine, but it does bother other people. So why not just use neutral language there? The other thing I would say is when you have a diverse audience of people from around the globe or around your company, is make sure that you're not using acronyms that haven't been defined. I've been in meetings or I've coached people who are using acronyms that might be common for them, but then I'll pause and ask, does 100% of the people in your room, in that meeting, in that audience, know what this acronym means? And if they hesitate, that's an indicator to me that not 100% no, so you need to define it first. Otherwise, you lose people. They're going to Google. They're messaging somebody else in the meeting. They're spacing out because they don't think they understand what you're even talking about. And all of those are a loss. So it's so simple to just be clear at the beginning. Then you get to say the acronym and use it throughout the rest of the time.
Wonderful. Wonderful. As we near the end, I'd like to talk about advice for aspiring leaders that are really seeking to master this skill. Amy, Sharon, what advice do you have?
So my advice would be, in an age where we do a lot of recordings of calls, I would start with that. It's a great look at yourself in the mirror to see yourself speak, answer questions. I still do it today. Every time I present, which I do every Monday in front of the executive committee, it's important for me to go back to evaluate everything and above, right? You know, how I was presenting, to how I answered the questions, to how swiftly I might have moved through the presentation based on the time I was allotted. I would also say that reach out to trusted advisors that you have within your organization or outside your organization with mentors, that you may have a very important presentation coming up and you just want to have them listen to you and give you objective feedback, particularly if it's a larger audience and that you might not know the audience as well. I would get different mentors and a different perspective so I can see how they're viewing me. So I would give those as the 2 top tips.
Excellent. Excellent. Anything to add, Amy?
I think my advice is pretty similar. I would just go back to the preparation and practice piece of it. And that is even I have people practice using the audio voice memo on their phone as a tool to listen back to their answer. So they get to be the questioner and the ask and the answerer in that way. And while it's weird to hear yourself, it helps remove the stress of like a video or something where then you're suddenly analyzing everything else. But it's a way to hear, am I coming across polished? Do I have the clear example in there to that response? And then certainly to piggyback on what Sharon was just saying, I think making sure that you're checking in ahead of time with people that are going to be in the meeting to say, hey, I'm really working on this skill. I would love your feedback on how I respond to questions. And if we could just have a quick 15 minutes exchange in the days that follow, that would really be helpful to me. And I think that people actually like to be helpful. They don't even have to be your manager. It could be a colleague that can just give you that little bit of feedback that can help reinforce what you're doing well and then help you upgrade and notice the things you still need to improve.
So true. That is such a great point. There's no way of getting around the fact that doing this well takes confidence. Dan, any advice for developing that confidence, not only to be an effective presenter, but to hold your own in the moment?
I was a little bit lucky to come into the communications realm from a local news background where I was live quite a bit and didn't really have the option to stop talking, and you had to stick to the facts and stick to what your reporting has borne out throughout the day or the week. But when it comes to confidence and public speaking and things like that, one thing that I will always remain is curious. I want to ask questions of the audience. I want them to feel like I value their presence more than I want them to value mine. I want to connect, whether it's through body language or through, if it's virtual, just kind of letting them know, like, I am interested in what you are getting out of this. I want to make sure that you find value in this workshop and this presentation. But for the actual communicating itself, I love the idea of recording yourself and listening back. As difficult as that is for a lot of people, myself included, it really is where I have made the most strides, whether it's from video or audio. Hearing or watching yourself, you immediately learn what you don't like about the way you communicate. Whether it's, I hate the way that I kept, my tick of scratching my sideburn, or the way that I said or like, too much, which I'm going to watch this back and I certainly will probably critique myself. But it is, you have to accept that you're not perfect and that it's never going to be 100% what you wanted it to be. And presenting your best self, telling the truth, and, sticking to the person that was booked for this speaking engagement or for this meeting. Like, you are there for a reason. And that is something that has taken me a long time throughout my own career to accept that I belong here. And, there's a reason I'm here. And sometimes I have to remind myself that, even in this very meeting, as I was sitting here with executives, and it can be intimidating sometimes, but there's a reason that you are where you are, and the communication part of it, I think, comes from a genuine curiosity and a genuine appreciation for the actual back and forth. And I'm learning a lot here in this setting today, just by listening and taking notes. And, I try to do that wherever I am. I try to take lessons from every back and forth I have with an audience. But the confidence, I think, is something that you have to very intentionally approach that. You have to, try to measure each time, like, after the fact, I was, say, a 6 out of 10 on that one. I want to be a 7.5 or an 8 next time. You try to measure, set goals, and that mark your own improvement. And if it's not improving the way that you want or envision, take stock of it. Ask a mentor, ask a colleague, what do you think I could do to, accelerate my improvement, or just to fine tune a few things?
Absolutely. Absolutely, Dan. One of the things I'm really struck by is I'm having the pleasure of talking to 3 people who are very, very experienced and accomplished speakers. And I'm hearing that all of you still invest time in improving. I always liken it to Steph Curry. He's arguably one of the best basketball players in the world. And wow, the amount of time he invests in practicing. And this skill has so much impact on how you're perceived and therefore your overall success. So practice, practice, practice. I want to thank you very, very much. All kinds of great advice came out of this. Hopefully the audience has been monitoring chat. We've dropped a lot of really useful resources. And thank you. Thank you to all of you who tuned in. Excellent engagement. And you helped to make this interactive by sharing your comments and feedback. If this is a skill that you'd like to learn more about and invest more time in honing, I really urge you to check out our Power Blocks. We have a Power Block 90-minute session focused exclusively on this topic and skill set. I also urge you to tune in next month for PowerSpeaking Live, where we'll talk about how to be concise in the way in which you communicate. Thank you again.